Men det har blivit dags att vidga våra vyer och gå in på den internationella scenen. Vi har väldigt många internationella talare här idag. Och vi ska kolla lite på den programmatiska handeln ur ett europeiskt perspektiv. And hence we switch to English. And I'm honored to be able to present IAB's Chief Economist, Daniel Knapp. Welcome up on stage and a big round of applause.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for having me. I think we saw from the business intelligence team already lots of statistics, and I'm not going to spare you today. There is 20 minutes packed with statistics about the European market. I want to speak, of course, about programmatic, but situated a bit more broadly in the overall economic context and also in the context of the structural changes that we're seeing in the industry. It's a time of heightened uncertainty. There isn't a master plan. There isn't a compass on how the next years in digital advertising are going to pan out. But one thing is clear, that the nature of programmatic is changing. There are going to be new pipes and new ambitions and tools that completely change how we all will work in programmatic. So that's going to be my topic for the next 20 minutes. But first, some depressing news. I had hoped that I didn't need to show this slide again. I showed it earlier this year. Welcome to the polycrisis. The Germans have a word for such a drawing here behind me. Krisenbilder, or crisis picture. Anything depressing, the Germans do have a word for it. The important thing to note here is that we know we're in heightened uncertainty. It's not just one crisis, but there are many different crises. What makes a polycrisis unique is that they are mutually combining, co-constituting, and augmenting crises. And you can see this with the arrows. Some support other crises, lift them, and so forth. We can see some things fading out, of course, here on the top left, Omicron, not really important anymore, but I had to add, of course, the Middle Eastern war escalation here at the bottom. So there's a heightened period of uncertainty. And we know that advertising is a pretty fickle beast. It overreacts to economic trends. When the economy is slightly up, advertising is also up a little bit more, usually by a factor of 1.5 to 2.5. But even when the economy is flat, advertising is down. If the economy is down a little bit, advertising is down a lot more. There's a lot of panic mode, of course. And you know, ad budgets, marketing budgets can be cut quite quickly and quite short term in terms of uncertainty. And this is something we have to bear in mind, and also that makes my job as a forecaster much more difficult. It was fairly smooth sailing with the Lehman crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and so forth, but there was a singular economic event affecting how advertisers spend budgets, how they allocate them, how they dial them up and down. This isn't the case anymore. Again, there isn't really a master plan for how to analyze this. And yes, we've seen GDP figures. Some have been revised upwards, some have been revised downwards. But they're also an incomplete view of what's really going on. A lot is based on perception, on sentiment. You know, in our highly empirical world based on numbers, what we never should exclude is feeling, how things are perceived to go. And we can see, of course, feeling also expressed in numbers, at least in a little bit here. So this is the European Union's Economic Optimism Index. It's unique because it blends together how consumers feel about the economy, their financial prospects and so forth, but also what governments and companies think, all together in one single index. And this is here the overall European Union, and we see a journey here from, in a sense, 1-year journey. We have come out of COVID, the first times of uncertainty started. We saw clouds on the horizon in end of Q3, Q4 2022, and then we hope that things would get better, that we have more visibility. But overall, you can see there was a little positive arc spanning here across the time, but actually right now, we're exactly where we started. So things remain extremely uncertain. The good news is, for digital advertising overall, that we have overperformed in past crises. So here behind me is the history of these different crises, right? We got on the very left, we got the dot-com crash. Digital was tiny, just in its infancy. We have the Lehman crisis, the financial crisis of 08 and 09, the Eurozone crisis, and of course, COVID. What you can see here is, of course, a combination of online and traditional media. How did they grow in these times of uncertainty? And you can see clearly that traditional media contracted quite a bit, whereas online didn't, right? We can see, yes, if we look at, for instance, here 2001, the entire new economy was wiped out. But apart from that, there hasn't been a single decline in digital advertising, despite the tough going in those years. We can also see that typically crises take around 2 years, right? It starts somewhere, first gradually, slowly, then suddenly the plunge comes, and then a slow recovery comes. Typically, recovery is 2 to 3 years, but the main effect of the crisis is 2 years. And the important thing to note on this slide here is that this overperformance of digital advertising happened despite the fact that, of course, digital advertising occupied far more market share during that time. Right now, I'm going to show it in a few slides, we're at nearly 63% of all paid media that is digital in Europe. So this outperformance should make us positive that despite doom and gloom stories and overall maybe stagnation or sometimes even contraction in marketing budgets, that digital is going to fare relatively better. Measurability, the switch on, switch off nature of digital, tactic and strategic, and of course all media are digital, but there's some other reasons in the logic of how advertisers think that should make us hopeful, which I'm going to show you in a second. However, the question is, by how much can we outperform? Because there is kind of a ceiling here, and the ceiling is of course 100% of all media. So here's a little history of digital advertising. On this chart here, you can see many different things. The first I want to direct your attention to is the x-axis. Now we go from 2000 and what do we have here? 2001 up to the end here. Each on the x-axis is a percentage, right? Each year it's linear. Each year is a percentage, and this percentage means the digital media's share of overall advertising budgets. On the y-axis, we can see the outperformance, i.e., by how many percentage points did digital advertising grow faster than all other media in a given year? Something that's pretty obvious, of course. In the beginning, when digital was small, with this massive spike, this massive overperformance. But I think what's really remarkable is that in a time of a lot of structural transformation in our industry, in the middle here, the light blue bit, we had the rise of programmatic, of social, of video, digital moved from performance to brand building, etc. We had an extremely stable outperformance. Of course, there was the outlier, the COVID blip, when we were all online, e-commerce, online streaming exploded, etc. Now, what we have is an underperformance relative to these previous years. We're growing, and likely going to grow, slower in relation to other media than before. Makes sense, because, as you can see, we're far more mature. But if you look at that dotted line here, actually, the underperformance or the slower performance isn't as severe as we might think, because it's partly still the correction from this exuberance that we saw during the COVID period. So at least short term, the outperformance of digital versus other media continues. But the question, of course, is with 63% of all media being digital, with signal loss all around us, how do we measure, how do we target, etc., can we continue to grow? Where does new money come from when nearly all media have already become digitized in some way? Well, part of the answer lies in how advertisers are thinking. The good news for us overall is that advertisers are, despite the polycrisis, at least globally, not really cutting budgets. And there's no better category to illustrate this than consumer packaged goods. They publish lots of information about advertising to their financial investors because it's such an important bit of their business. What you can see behind me here is the Q4 results in terms of how much growth was in these companies, not advertising overall. And you can see it's single or double digit, despite already in 2022, the clouds forming on the horizon. And you can see the outlook at the bottom here, which is by how much they think they're going to grow in the future in 2023. That's also pretty hopeful. For 2024, the picture now looks similar. Why is this important? Because CPG companies typically set their advertising investments as a percentage of revenue. i.e., when revenue goes up, ad budget goes up as well. We're in a high inflation environment, which some think is bad, but actually inflation triggers advertising because the prices that companies can pass, the higher prices they can pass on to consumers are typically higher than the higher prices that they are getting from their suppliers. So counterfactually, actually, inflation helps the market. But there's something else here. These businesses are not growing anymore. It's not as smooth sailing as before. So this kind of warning plot here behind me. We don't have to go into all the details, just see clearly green means good, red means bad, and the rest is somewhere in the middle. The important thing to note here is that we have different eras, right? On the left, we can see growth, we can see cost of goods sold, profitability, and so forth. And let's exclude the pandemic because it was an extraordinary event. But the last period where these companies, they make a huge part of the overall ad economy, really grew well was during what economists call the Goldilocks era. The Goldilocks era isn't a band or anything like that. It means it's an area when there's smooth sailing. The economy is going well, unemployment is low, consumer savings are high, etc. But this period is gone, low interest rates. This period is gone. And we're now seeing that revenue growth is lower and profitability is under pressure. They need to do something different. And you can see this very easily when you look at job descriptions. Unilever doesn't have a CMO anymore. Unilever has a Chief Digital and Commerce Officer. Note that title, Digital and Commerce. It's marketing and sales in one role. It's the thing that we've been talking about for the last 50 years maybe. How can that, in a sense, that bubble of the CMO world be related to the wider business metrics? This is now happening with a lot of corporate restructuring. And you can see this also means that these companies are pouring more money into digital. Here's some quotes from some leading marketers behind me, which you can see from their earnings reports, right? Procter & Gamble, more than 50% of spend now on digital, which is remarkable because you had mass media and mass brands, television and consumer brands, really support each other. They couldn't grow without each other in the 20th century. This is suddenly different now. Similar with L'Oreal and Unilever building digital marketing and investment and commerce hubs together. This is part of what these companies call revenue management. It is to make sure that every dollar, every euro, every kroner they invest really works extremely well. They're building out new digital efficiency solutions through IT investments and so forth. And suddenly, the IT investments are being connected to the ad tech investments. So you, for the first time, have actually pipes of data flowing between very, very different types of the business. Question, can we in Europe benefit from that? Because we are in an extremely high inflation environment. I've been doing market sizing data for the last 15 years, and never had we had to do it in such a high inflation environment. Some of you may know the ad spend data that we put out also, thank you, with a very kind help of IAB Sweden for Europe. And at first, growth in 2022 looked still pretty good, right? We had an overall nearly 10% growth. Here you can see the different markets ranked. Now, Turkey going through the roof, of course, but of course they had 70% inflation. And if I want to be a little bit of a downer and say, let's include headline consumer price inflation in this and correct the numbers, the picture looks like this. If we factor out inflation, the market already was quite stagnant. Good news is things are improving, but it also means that there is less growth currently available than we tend to think. If we look at things in one picture, we can see a very different structure of markets. So the UK, right here, is a planet of its own. It's a huge market, of course, and it's much larger than, for instance, Germany, which has a population of 20 million more. On the x-axis, you have digital ad spend per head, i.e. per capita, and on the y-axis, the growth. And you have some markets in here, which you can see, Finland here, Germany, for instance, France, where's even Italy, down there, right? Large European markets that are less mature than some of their counterparts, and also growing less. These are markets with still a lot of money invested in newspapers, in television, and so forth. If that money gets unlocked, there's new growth coming into digital. You have, of course, if you look at Sweden, you are pretty far ahead here as well with the Nordic markets, of course, partly because it's fairly wealthy markets, but also you digitized quite early on. So money can't really come from other media anymore. It needs to come from new channels, trade marketing, retail media, and so forth, plus this revenue management that companies are doing. If you look at what's the market we're playing in currently, what pot of money is available for programmatic, it's the bit here on the very left. That's the display market in Europe, excluding social. Around 25% of all paid media investments in digital are in here. So this is where programmatic is playing. We saw, though, if we look at the growth figures, something remarkable happened last year, right? Look at the social bit in the middle. 7% growth for social. inflation not figured out. The rest, other bits growing much faster. This has never happened before. It's the first time that social underperformed the rest of the market. Of course, with the signal loss, but we also have a lot of saturation where there now is, in a sense, a competition for the same users between the different platforms. And we see CTV, retail media pacing ahead, Amazon and so forth. So this is really fueling the overall display market. What we're also seeing is more spend moving into video. We can see so branding budgets are actually fairly stable. We've seen an increase in video budgets overall. 6 markets now already 50% over 50% of budgets is video. And also audio, showing some strong growth and remarkable patterns in Europe. Where, again, we have a similar bubble chart, but the cast here, the players, the actors are quite different. If you look at the right here, these are the most mature markets. You can see Ireland is there, Belgium, Spain, Germany, markets that didn't feature at all on the previous map, really. So this is because some of the markets with strong legacy radio markets are now adopting audio quite quickly. There's an analogy here for other formats. We saw in the previous presentation, digital out of home, for instance. So we're seeing more and more capture of digital media from other analog channels which are just becoming digitized and being connected to the overall programmatic ecosystem. Programmatic today, how big is it? Well, it's 13.3 billion euros, excluding social, in Europe. And we can see here the maturity of different markets. And again, Sweden here is in the top third behind me. You can see what percentage of all available money outside social that in principle could be traded programmatically is actually being traded programmatically, right? The huge difference in markets are partly because some markets are very conservative, in particular markets that are very sell-side driven, with strong publisher lobbies that have been controlling data, controlling inventory for a long time, which is why Germany is kind of down here, there it is, down there somewhere. But it shows also there's a lot of headroom for growth still in programmatic, despite the strong penetration. But the nature of programmatic is changing. I mentioned new pipes. We're now moving into a world where not everybody is transacting with everybody anymore, but first-party data partnerships are being built. We're moving from a networked world to a world of one-on-one relationships, often exclusive or semi-exclusive in nature. And I think what illustrates it very well is this trajectory of the move away from the open marketplace to, despite the problems of execution, managing it, etc., to the private marketplaces. Another thing that we're seeing is that vendors are being cut out. Here is a view of a typical UK publisher. That's actual data. They have, I think, far too many SSPs. But for a long time, publishers thought the more integrations, the better. What we can see is how quickly we're reaching diminishing returns here. Because this chart, by the way, as you can see, doesn't start at 0, it starts at 50. Meaning the incremental gains from a lot of partners is close to 0. So we're seeing now a lot of publishers cutting out this long tail and focusing on more exclusive partnerships, which also allow more kind of granular, more confidential data transfers happening. So another indication of the programmatic world moving to pipes. And this helps also advertisers allocate more spend to programmatic because they can activate their own data that's not getting lost in the bid stream. The pipe suggestion also comes to the foreground again if we look at the advertisers. Right? Previously, we had ad tech solutions that buyers and sellers logged into. But increasingly, we see a convergence, a merging of the cloud world and the ad tech world, where advertisers are now increasingly funneling the ad tech data into their own cloud environments where they're analyzing it. And this seems benign and simple and technical and boring, but it's actually a sea change, because it means that programmatic data, performance, transaction data, etc., is coming much more closely into the operations brain of advertising companies. This is something that I believe we as an industry need to push far more in order to unlock further growth. And I think who described this very well is Jonathan Mendes, an IT and cloud expert, who made this quote: "We're moving from services and point solutions, think of your DSP, your SSP, built on the cloud and packaged as a product that you rent, you have your seat, you pay your monthly fee, etc., to something quite different, to services and applications that are being built in the cloud and packaged as products that you own." So advertisers are building pipes, end-to-end relationships. And the future of programmatic is to be part of those Lego blocks, to enable those building blocks. Of course, where's new money coming from? I think one thing that's pretty clear is it's coming from outside the existing world. Here's an S1 statement, a pre-IPO statement of a company called Maple Bear. Who of you knows what Maple Bear is? It's not a Canadian honey. You all know it. It's Instacart. It's the trading name for Instacart. And I did some counting here. I was curious. Is it a commerce or an advertising company? And they mentioned the term advertise, ads, advertising 445 times in the statement. And the word commerce just above 100 times. So it shows you that they are seeing CPG, it's all CPG, CPG, transaction and commercial data as a core ingredient to fuel the future of advertising. This is important for programmatic. The overall world, of course, of retail media is growing quite quickly. These are our forecasts here. But Amazon is in here, 78%. So we have to remove this. And we see the market is far smaller, but it's still already a multi-billion euro market across Europe. Many retailers are saying, well, we need to increase retail media revenue with a landing zone. You can see this here, right, these 4 years. But there's still a lot of growth required to match this, in particular in Europe compared to the US. It's easier, as you can see on this slide here, it's far easier for last-mile delivery companies and for marketplaces, because for them advertising is a tax. If you're a shawarma shop and you want your shawarma to be delivered, you have to advertise. It's digital rent. The same is not the case for retailers who need to build ad ops capabilities, ad tech capabilities, to become a hybrid instead of a media owner and an agency. So it's far less certain. But growth is here. This is, I think, very important for us, that retail media is going to outperform the rest of digital media for quite a long time and by a large margin. Programmatic is crucial for this. You can see 3 different models emerging to, in a sense, combat the fragmentation of the dozens of retail media networks that we have. I'm not going to go into detail now for the matter of time, but you can see 3 different models. One is, in a sense, an ad network model on the left. Then you can see a platform rental model in the middle, and then a hybrid of the two, where you have technology and hands-on keyboard together. For them to be successful, they need to move into the offsite world. I use that retailer data offsite. That often means programmatically. I believe a lot of growth in our industry is going to come from this. But our industry is changing, of course, because we're automating many more things. The metaverse expert has retreated in the bushes and is re-emerging as an AI expert quite quickly. So we have to be careful what we're hearing in this world. But it's an important world, of course, because if you look at what agencies are saying, their earnings calls are just awash with statements on AI. How does it affect us? There are doom and gloom scenarios, but I think the future is far more mundane. AI can solve programmatic complexity that we couldn't really deal with before. Here's an example, I'm going to build it up very quickly here, of one advertiser in Germany that I used to work with. It's an auto advertiser. They have all these different things together, so there are 146.3 trillion ways how they could mix all of these programmatic ingredients together. It exceeds human cognition by far. But now we can find recipes and ways of approaching this that weren't possible before. A huge issue with this is ethics. Here you can see the number of publications submitted to the world's leading AI ethics conference. And an issue here is, of course, ethics is huge. It's the new GDPR. When we thought GDPR was easy, it's going to get much more complicated. But the good news is we as an industry are leaning in. There are more and more submissions to the conference from the industry side. And I think it's a topic where we as a programmatic industry can become early movers to show that we're not on the defensive like with GDPR, but show the importance of automation, the impact on creativity, and so forth. Will AI lead to job losses in programmatic? Will a bot take over what we do? I don't think so. We can see here in the background the Excel spreadsheets of the 1950s. A big desk and a big piece of paper where things were done out manually. So previous technology revolutions haven't really reduced jobs, they have just made more jobs. And we can see this in programmatic as well, right? You look here, behind me you have the, in a sense, you have the employees in US digital agencies and the share of programmatic. Clearly correlation isn't causation, but it's an interesting story where you can see that the more automation means more people. Lastly, I think a bifurcation in programmatic is occurring. On the one hand, with the hyper-transparent world, where advertisers are completely accountable for everything, scrutinizing, X-raying the supply chain. And on the other hand, it's a find-forget model done by black box models now with Performance Max and others where creative targeting, etc., are all merging together. In this world, I think what's happening is we're seeing the re-emergence of the role of creative. Behind me, just as an example, evidence on how important creative is for performance-lifting campaigns. We've always focused in our industry on the data side, the data only. If data becomes more automated when the pipes are being built, I think we'll spend as an industry much more time on creative optimization and working with creatives. I think this is going to revolutionize our industry overall. Behind me, my last slide, you can see evidence from a guy called Michael Farmer, who wrote a fantastic book called Manslaughter on Madison Avenue, probably the most brutal title of any advertising book in history. And he codified every little production bit that you do in advertising, every spot you make, every TV spot, every Instagram post, in something called a scope metric unit to quantify the unquantifiable, the creative. You've seen that the cost, the revenue per scope metric unit went from $445,000 USD in 1992 to just $124,000 in 2001, meaning more work, less revenue for agencies. And I think part of it is because we had these separate P&Ls, the media and the creative bit. And Rory Sutherland, the advertising pundit, said, media agencies have become very good at making money without creative, and creative agencies are very bad at making money from media. And I think in this new world of AI-driven programmatic, we can bring these two together, be it in a single P&L or a single workflow. And I think that together with the revenue management imperatives of advertisers should make us hopeful for a very exciting world of programmatic despite the poly-crisis. Thank you.
IAB Sveriges premium members. Show Heroes Group. Magnite. 3 kronor, a making science company. TV4. Quantcast. Verve Group. RTB House. Kantar. Bauer Media. Hubmatic. The Trade Desk. Och Adform.